we're going to bring in Dr. Rand McClain, who's a leading mind in regenerative and sports medicine techniques using nutrition and various therapies around the country. He's based out in California. But again, off the top of the show tonight, we talked about sports and their plans to return to play. And we're getting to that point now, whether it be various professional leagues, whether eventually it will be the high school and college kids who have all had this long layoff now. And I wanted to get the doctor on to talk a little bit about some of the challenges for some of these various sports in what they're going to go through. Doctor, good evening. Thanks for the time tonight.
Hey, good evening. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, great to have you on. I want to start in particular just because earlier today I had a conversation with Predators defenseman Mattias Ekholm, who actually flew back to Sweden when all this happened, and he's sitting at home there and trying to figure out how and when the NHL will resume and how to get back to America for the season this summer. But the NHL in total has been off since March 12th, about 7 weeks or so, moving up on 2 full months, probably before they would get back even for individual workouts. For any professional athlete that's been off that long and all they can maybe do is some home gym type of stuff, certainly not the typical training they're used to, how would you recommend they start ramping it back up for a potential season that might resume in 3 or 4 weeks?
Well, it's an interesting question and a little bit loaded. I would say that with my guys that I'm familiar with, and not to assume that he's any different, they're not woefully out of shape. I mean, these guys do this for a living. They love their sport. And whenever I've had conversations with my athletes, sure, the initial conversation is about, what happens with COVID-19 and how can I avoid it along with my family. But the larger part of the conversation is, hey, doc, how can I stay in shape? And so my guess is most of these guys are, unless they're fibbing to me and actually squeezing beer cans on the couch, staying pretty fit. At least, 75, 80%, 85% of their max. And sure, they're not in the gyms and their training centers like they used to be, but they can still get plenty done at home. So, timeline-wise, we were kind of alerted to this about 3 weeks ago. So most of the guys have been on edge and starting to ramp back up. I'd say in another 3 weeks, so for a total of 6 weeks, they can be in pretty doggone good shape and ready to get started. Maybe not at 100%, but close to it.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to allege that any of these guys are out of shape in the time they've been off, because they are certainly self-disciplined in that regard. But there is a difference between being in shape and being in game-ready shape, or in the case of the NBA or NHL, potentially like playoff-ready shape when they get back. Specifically for hockey, since we're here in Nashville, is there any way that you would recommend a guy simulate, because none of these guys really have been able to get on the ice? Is there any concerns you would have about that, about getting back and skating quickly and how quickly they can ramp that up?
Yeah, and your point is well taken. There is a big difference between a lot of exercises that you can do to simulate being on the ice, and certainly protective exercises, keeping the balance, staying fit, and actually being on the ice. And a lot of it's really more mental because, for example, someone gets back on the ice, they may be at 85 to 95, let's just pick a number, percent of their max physical condition. But, these guys are the best. And how are they going to help themselves in a game situation not believe they're 100% when they get a pass from across the ice and want to do what they did just, a month and a half ago? That's going to be one of the biggest limitations, is not ramping up too quickly and sort of reining it in for the first few weeks as they get their legs back, literally.
What do you think are going to be the biggest things we see as these guys get back into training? Oftentimes we see at the start of NFL training camps, for instance. Again, guys who by no means are out of shape, but we see specific injuries start as practices begin. Do you think we're going to see a flurry of that in the various sports, and what are the things you would specifically be looking for?
Don't shoot the messenger, but yeah, to your point, I mean, this happens in regular times, so it's more likely to happen in times like these, especially the way they're talking about jiggering the schedule, right? Maybe not the same with NHL, but certainly some of the other sports. They're talking about doubleheaders more so than ever with Major League Baseball. But yeah, you can expect more injuries. How do you avoid it? As I mentioned earlier, ramp up a little more slowly, whether it's from the athlete being more careful to the trainers, getting on them to be more careful. The injuries occur from overdoing it. You've all heard that before. And it's not just muscular, it's nervous system as well. And these guys have been sitting on the couch, figuratively and some of them literally, but as you said, always staying in shape, but meaning itching to get back in the game. And the caution there is to not overdo it in the start and be ready for the long term.
We're visiting with Dr. Rand McClain, Chief Medical Officer of LCR Health out in California, talking about the return to sports for a lot of these leagues, hopefully sooner rather than later. I'm glad you brought up baseball. I'm a former pitcher, had some arm issues at times, throwing in the best of times. Now you have these pitchers who've taken probably almost 2 months off by the time they would come back from truly throwing in any sort of a live situation at spring training. And there's discussion again that they may only get 3, maybe 4 weeks to ramp up before the regular season would now begin in baseball. What message would you give pitchers as they get started? And are we going to have pitchers on serious pitch counts as the season begins?
Well, it's a good question, and not to dodge it, but it's all going to depend on, as you know, being a pitcher, various factors. How overworked were you coming into this situation, right? Maybe the rest could do you some good. How old are you? Because there's a big difference between a 23-year-old and a 38-year-old pitcher, right? And what you can and can't do and what you should and shouldn't do. But yeah, we're obviously going to have to pay more attention to what's going on out there. And it's going to be, there's no doubt there's going to be a learning curve. So by identifying it like you are with questions like these up front, which I'm sure is going to be a big part of this, hopefully we can avoid some of those injuries, because that's the last thing you want is for someone to get injured because they weren't prepared. I mean, that goes, again, regular season or a weird one like this.
Doctor, this I'm sure is not your specialty in terms of infectious diseases, but one of the things you also hear from everybody talking about is how to be sure that players, teams, whoever is in the arena or in the stadium when they come back, whether there are fans or no fans, that they can ensure that health and safety will be first and foremost and able to be accomplished there. From the conversations you've heard from people throughout the medical field, are we close to that? Do you feel confident that if Major League Baseball or the NBA gets back to play in June, let's say, that can be accomplished?
Well, I think it's all going to be a matter of opinion in more ways than one. For one, there's not going to be 100% risk mitigation. That's impossible. But there will be what we imagine will be a consensus of some sort as to what amount of risk we're willing to undergo for the benefit of getting these guys back to work and are enjoying whatever sport we want to watch. Is it possible? Absolutely. I think we're moving to, look, listen to Fauci, listen to Trump. It sounds to me like the groupthink is moving in that direction. And given that, and knowing that there's going to be some risk involved, right now it's just a matter of logistics and doing the best we can to tamp down the risk as much as possible. There's going to be costs involved, and the linchpin to all of this is going to be the regular testing. You've heard a lot about it, and I think one of the confusions is the difference between testing the United States in general and doing 500,000 tests a day versus, for example, a league like Major League Baseball, you do an envelope calculation depending upon where you draw the line of necessary personnel that need to be tested along with the players, et cetera. You could be talking 5,000, 10,000 players a day in the beginning. That's doable. That's doable yesterday.
Well, that's certainly positive news there. Doctor, before we let you go, we also have obviously a huge audience out here of parents with children who could be getting ready for a Little League season at some point this summer after not doing anything all spring, or high school athletes who maybe missed the spring season who will then be ramping things up for next fall, even college athletes that have been out of school and off campus away from coaches and strength coaches and supervisors the entire spring. For the kids out there, not the professional athletes that you have a pretty good idea of where they are, what's your best advice to them in terms of getting set to go play again?
Be smart about it, and that really boils down to not pushing yourself too hard. It's almost cliche nowadays not to overtrain, but understand what that is and don't do it. Meaning, hey, obviously you can push too hard on the field, but there's another part of that, which is not eating enough, not keeping your nutrition up on the other side of it, if you will, not getting enough rest. So that goes for professional athletes too, but to all the kids out there, the non-professionals, understand what this has done. Take it in stride. We can't control this, but what we can control is our reaction to it. And don't jump back in and overtrain. That no one wants to sit on the bench. And if you overtrain to the point where you get injured, you're bench bound. So be smart about it.
Yeah, and I imagine that goes for normal citizens as well, going back to the gym or running again. You don't have to be an athlete for that. Just don't overdo it when you start.
And it's hard to do when you've been cooped up this long and can't wait to get back to your sport. I understand, but again, think about the consequences of not doing that.
Yeah. Well, Doctor, I really appreciate the time, and I had some specific questions, hockey and baseball and those sort of things that you answered very well. Just because I don't have chief medical officers on a lot, especially during a pandemic on a sports show, is there anything else that you think we should be thinking about or know as we get set for this new era in sports?
Well, I think it's going to improve. One of the things that comes to mind is in another month or so, maybe even less, we may be acting more stringently in major league sports than we do in the general populace, and that's going to help, right? Just last week we found out that remdesivir is useful. It's not, as Fauci said, it's not a knockout punch, but we may find other tools that help us treat this and again tamp down the risk and make this less of a threat than it is. And that might open up more, certainly, political avenues to get this going. Again, the players are the ones here in the beginning, anyway, that are assuming the risk. But I definitely am an optimist, and I'll say that up front. But that aside, I think things are looking positive for us. Eventually, we'll find either more treatments and/or a vaccine, and fans will be allowed back in. So I think we're moving in the right direction. I don't see any major setbacks.
Wow. Dr. Ray McClain, I really appreciate your time tonight. Very informative stuff. I'm just thankful there's people out there like you that know their stuff as well as you do and giving us great advice to help us get through this time. Thanks so much.
Well, my pleasure, sir. Anytime.
Dr. Ray McClain, the Chief Medical Officer of LCR Health. Again, one of the leading minds in regenerative and sports medicine, using nutrition, various other things to get people back up and moving, get athletes back up and moving, and bringing our sports back. Fascinating conversation tonight. We'll take a break. We are way behind, but we'll come back. We'll continue on. Phone lines open, by the way, 737-7767. This is SportsLine on NewsChannel 5+.